Okay, hello everybody. I'm sorry that I can't be there today, and this is probably even more boring having to just listen to my boring voice as I talk, but bear with me, I'll try to be as interesting as I can and stay within the time frame. My study was called The Cognition of Classification, a Reading Science Connection. My framework that I used to look at this was Piaget. My literature showed that using Piaget's theory of cognitive development allows us to really understand the nature of reading and the kind of reader that a person is going to be. To understand a person's reading ability, it's recommended that we first gain an understanding of their perceptual and their cognitive skills. Piaget's stages offer really the best lens for considering the cognitive dimensions of the reading process. And Piaget, of course, broke up his developmental stages into what he called operational levels. An operational level has been consistently shown to be a significant factor in reading achievement tests and standardized tests, which, of course, we're all very concerned about these days. Briefly, the operational levels, pre-operational, concrete, formal, I'm not going to go into these in great detail other than to talk about what parts of those impact the classification process. So the pre-operational child can only think in what they call one variable thinking, so they can't consider more than one aspect of something at a time. It's not until the concrete period that they're able to use a concrete object as a vehicle to think about something more abstract. At the formal operational process, we're able to actually release that reliance on concrete objects and think about language kind of as an object in itself. This relates strongly to classification, particularly as we move to higher level classification, as one variable classifying is not going to be very useful. We need to be able to consider something to have 4 legs and a tail and it's a mammal. We have to be able to think about things on more than one level in order to classify them in any sort of useful way, both in the sciences and really in everyday life. So classification is a very important marker in a child's operational level. And this goes on to the reading connection, because not only do we have operational level as being an important marker, specifically classification tasks have been found to be an important predictor of a student's reading ability. When you think about this, we're talking about making relationships between knowledge, taking the subjects from one group, the subjects from another group. How are they similar? How are they different? This is what research indicates to be kind of an inferencing skill. It's the background of an inferencing skill. So even though I know I never thought about classification as being a reading skill, the research shows that it is. And I think when we think about underlying cognitive processes, so we're thinking about second order impacts as opposed to first order, this is obviously impacting that, that's obviously impacting this. This is something that underlies these basic processes. So my interest in classification goes along with my science interest, because the underpinnings of most science disciplines are classification skills. The majority of science is taking the natural world, sorting it together. How are these things different? How are they the same, particularly in biology, which is what I teach. And a lot of times this calls on a lot of abstract reasoning, which gets even more difficult. We've got a classification problem at the operational level. We have an abstract reasoning problem. They go together, and it makes it very difficult for students to really interact with science, which impacts science reading, because already if you're having trouble reading because of your operational level, you're going to have even more of a problem when I get to the really abstract part of science skills. And I think the slide back there earlier said that in the secondary level, only 35% of high school students are actually at the formal operational level. And this presents a really large challenge for those of us in that area, because our content requires them to be at that high level. So the cognitive ability to use inferencing about features in order to classify is the same skill we need to use abstract text. So we want to be able to understand what sort of classification processes, which we could also call inferencing processes, people are using when they're being confronted with a categorization task. And so there's a lot of research on the different classification processes that people use, which I pulled together here. And my question is, how can we see patterns, or how can we use these classification processes to facilitate how we develop literacy, specifically in our content area, teaching? So my method is a Think Aloud process tracing study. I used a biological classification task. Hopefully there's a handout. I sent in an appendix that has the artifact that I used the person to classify with. And the subject that I had was my husband. He's a graduate level student. We can assume that he's in the formal operational phase. I don't know. He's an engineer. We'll just kind of assume that. So let me point out some of these codes. I don't want to necessarily get into detail on all that because it's already been 6 minutes, but I do want to point out a couple of the important ones at the top there. The exemplar-based model is a model where we're having stored examples. So, and it's not very specific, but we're just kind of like, oh, well, I know this guy was tall, and so you're kind of like him, so I'm going to judge you as tall. And there's the kind of pitfall of that is you have to have stored examples, and it's very personal. It's based on you instead of being based on maybe additional information. The rule-based model, when we've got, okay, you're over 6 feet in height, you're tall. Rule plus exception is the fourth one down, and rule plus exception is pretty common. It's when I think we all have, can we think about it, we've all done this. We say, okay, well, there's an idea here, but nothing is 100%, so there's going to be exceptions, and I'll just memorize the exceptions when they show up. You can be a discriminative or a generative classifier. A discriminative category, the important part there is considered between categories. So we're classifying between categories. A generative focus, we look at within categories. So a discriminative person is going to be more likely to have a whole bunch of categories as opposed to creating a hierarchical structure where we see the similarities between things more so than we see the differences between things. And those are kind of the parts I want to push you to notice. So for the results, they were pretty much on par with what I expected from reading other research that was like this. My husband used an exemplar-based model for the most part, and he moved very quickly to rule plus exception when he realized that some of his categories weren't fitting well. Like, for example, if you look over at the aquatic one, he said, when he was thinking aloud in his notes, he said, well, water lily doesn't fit, but I guess it's the best choice there, so I'm going to put it there. And he continued on with this kind of exemplar-based discriminative model. He did not attempt to break any of these things down in a retrospective think aloud that he and I did together. I said, well, what were you thinking about all these different kinds of trees? And he said, well, at first I was thinking that flowers versus non-flowers, and that didn't work. And I said, well, you didn't consider trees that have flowers versus trees that don't have flowers. So that would be more of a hierarchical method, which would be where we would need him to be in order to be successful in a science classroom. So he didn't go there. He didn't go to that generative approach. And he also will point out fern being another example of his rule plus exception. Fern didn't really fit anywhere. He didn't know what to do with it. He went with, well, it's tall. So he ended up with it in the trees, which was not a good choice. But the research says that this discriminative learning paradigm is pretty much what we are we're teaching in the classroom. We're teaching them to be discriminative because we're not giving them categories, and we're kind of asking them to sort objects into categories on their own mind. And this makes them focus all their information or all their energy on distinguishing. And so there's so much impact on distinguishing that we're not causing them to look for similarities. So it's too much differences, not enough similarities. The generative pattern is where we're looking for general coherence between groups. And that generative pattern, the research shows, is what causes us to lead to that higher level, higher order classification skills, such as the hierarchical skill, which is where I notice my students really struggle. So the the overall conclusion here is we want to get everyone to be at a higher developmental level. We want them to be able to have robust category descriptions because we see that this is going to increase their literacy, it's going to increase their reading, it's going to increase their overall ability to cognitively interact with our content. And I think something like this, where we're focusing instead on the classification tasks specifically, is going to be more impactful for our science teachers than the simple content area reading kind of initiatives that we're seeing pushed out a lot. Science teachers, especially at the higher level, we have an instinctive hard time working with that paradigm because we realize that they can't read and we don't know why they can't read. And it's very difficult when we have content area standards that we have to teach. So I think something like this, where we're looking at underlying processes that are going to impact reading, we are going to see overall literacy gains there, but we're also going to see gains in the content, the specific content that we have to teach. I think this is going to be something that's going to be a lot more impactful in the long run, and that's going to be something that teachers can really get more involved in than some of the initiatives I see pushing out now. Here are my references. I had quite a few of them. If you're interested in any of this classification work, there's a lot of good work out there, even if some of it is a little bit older, because Piaget is maybe not the dominant paradigm in cognitive revolution right now, but I still think he does have something to say. Okay, thank you. I only went 1 minute over. I appreciate your patience. Hope you'll have a nice night.